On a quiet winter night in 1961, while most Americans slept peacefully in their homes, the United States came closer to destroying itself than during any moment of the Cold War. Not because of a Soviet missile, not because of espionage, not because of war, but because a fully armed American hydrogen bomb slipped from the wing of an American bomber and began an unstoppable descent toward the farmland of North Carolina. What investigators would discover in the days that followed became one of the most chilling revelations in U.S. nuclear history. 5 out of 6 safety mechanisms had already failed. Only a fragile, low-voltage switch prevented a blast powerful enough to erase entire cities. This is the story America tried to bury for decades. The night the U.S. almost nuked itself. 1. A routine mission that wasn't routine at all. The date was January 24, 1961. The Cold War was at its absolute peak. The United States and the Soviet Union lived on the edge of nuclear annihilation, and American strategy depended on constant readiness. That meant bombers loaded with thermonuclear weapons stayed in the air 24 hours a day, under a program known as Operation Chrome Dome. Flight 093, a B-50 Graham Stratofortress from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, was one of those bombers. Its mission was simple on paper: remain airborne, fully armed, and ready to strike Soviet targets if Washington gave the order. On board were 10 K-39 Mod to hydrogen bombs, each with a 3.8 megaton yield, more than 250 times the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The bomber carried enough destructive force to wipe out an entire U.S. state, but to the crew, this was just another routine flight. 2. The malfunction begins shortly after takeoff. The crew detected a fuel leak in the right wing. This was not unusual for the B-50 Grams variant. The aircraft had been modified with new wet-wing fuel tanks that saved weight, but introduced structural weaknesses. Under stress, these wings could crack, warp, or split. As Flight 093 continued its mission, the leak worsened rapidly. Fuel gushed out of the wing at thousands of pounds per hour. When the bomber attempted to refuel midair, the tanker crew saw something terrifying. The B-52 was losing fuel faster than it could take it in. Within minutes, the bomber was in crisis. The pilots aborted the mission and attempted to turn back towards Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. But it was too late. The right wing began to break apart. At 10,000 feet, the aircraft entered a violent roll. The pilots fought the controls, but the structural failure accelerated. The bomber tore open in midair. 8 men scrambled to escape. 5 would survive, 3 would not. And while the crew fought for their lives, something else happened, something far more dangerous. The bombs were released. 3. 2 nuclear bombs falling on America when the fuselage split open. Both Mk-39 hydrogen bombs detached from their mounting racks. Bomb 1 dropped cleanly, its descent immediately triggering automatic systems intended for wartime deployment. To the horror of investigators later, the bomb reacted exactly as if it had been deliberately dropped on a target. Its parachute deployed, slowing its descent. Inside the bomb, electrical signals moved through the circuitry just as they would during a nuclear strike. It began to arm itself. Bomb to plunge nose first at terminal velocity, slamming into a muddy swamp with tremendous force. It buried itself more than 200 feet into the ground. Its arming sequence was also partially triggered, but the impact disrupted internal components. The first bomb, however, continued drifting gently toward Goldsboro, a perfect nuclear delivery profile. If it detonated, everything within a 17-mile radius would vanish instantly. Raleigh, Fayetteville, Goldsboro, and parts of eastern North Carolina would become uninhabitable. The blast would have changed U.S. history forever. 4. The 6 safeties and how 5 failed nuclear weapons are designed with multiple redundant safeguards. The Mk-39 had 6 mechanical and electrical safety mechanisms. Investigators knew that for a bomb to detonate, all 6 needed to fail. But what they found in Goldsboro shocked even the most hardened nuclear engineers. 5 out of 6 safety systems had already failed. The bomb had passed through a fully armed release electrical charging activation of high-voltage circuits, switch rotation, parachute drop arming sequence and near completion of the internal detonation chain, only one tiny, low-voltage switch prevented the final triggering signal. Later, a Sandia National Laboratories engineer Parker F. Jones analyzed the incident and wrote a chilling conclusion. One simple dynamo technology, low-voltage switch stood between the United States and a major catastrophe. He titled his report, "How I Learned to Mistrust the H-Bomb." 5. What the explosion would have looked like a 3.8 megaton detonation over Goldsboro would have created. A fireball nearly 2 kilometers wide, complete destruction within 17 miles, lethal radiation across the entire state, fallout drifting as far as Washington, D.C. and New York, millions exposed, long-term contamination of farmland and rivers. The Cape Fear River basin would have been permanently poisoned. Entire counties would have ceased to exist. North Carolina, as we know it today, simply would not be on the map. 6. The second bomb still lies underground. Bomb to struck the swamp so hard that recovery teams could not reach its nuclear core. Despite digging for months, engineers could only retrieve parts of the casing and the primary stage. The thermonuclear secondary containing uranium remains buried in the earth to this day. The U.S. government bought the land and fenced it off. Official signs posted at the site still read, "Unauthorized digging prohibited." To this day, a portion of a hydrogen bomb is still under North Carolina. 7. The military tried to hide the truth immediately after the crash. The Air Force classified the entire incident. For decades, the official position was the bombs were never in danger of detonating. This was a lie. When Parker Jones' report was declassified in 2013 through the Freedom of Information Act, the American public learned the truth for the first time. Congressman David Price of North Carolina stated, "We were a whisker away from catastrophe. Even today, many key details are still redacted." 8. Broken arrows. The accidents America doesn't talk about. Goldsboro was not the only close call. The U.S. military has recorded at least 32 nuclear accidents known as broken arrows. Some of the most frightening include 1968, a B-52 crashed in Greenland with for hydrogen bombs. 1966, a mid-air collision dropped for bombs on Palomares, Spain. 1950, a bomb was lost in the Pacific Ocean, never recovered. 1980, the Damascus Titan E missile explosion nearly detonated a 9-megaton warhead in Arkansas. The common theme in all these incidents: complex systems fail, people make mistakes, accidents happen, and nuclear weapons do not forgive accidents. 9. The aftermath. Reforms born from terror. The Goldsboro incident forced the U.S. government to confront the terrifying reality of its own nuclear arsenal. Reforms included improved mechanical safety, stricter arming systems, redesigned firing circuits, stronger command and control procedures, new requirements for airborne alert missions. Operation Chrome Dome was eventually shut down. The era of nuclear bombs constantly flying overhead quietly ended, but only after the United States realized how close it had come to self-inflicted disaster. 10. The final lesson. The story of Goldsboro is not just a historical curiosity. It is a reminder of the fragility of the systems we trust to keep the world safe. It wasn't Soviet missiles or communist aggression that almost destroyed North Carolina. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't war. It was a leak, a cracked wing, a falling plane, and a single electrical switch that happened not to flip. Humanity survived that night not because of engineering brilliance, not because of perfect design, but because of luck. Luck saved millions of American lives, and luck is a dangerous thing to depend on. The human side. What the crew experienced while the official reports focus on mechanical failures and nuclear safeties. The incident also left deep emotional scars on the surviving crew of Flight 093. The man who parachuted from the disintegrating B-52 later described the moment as a fall into darkness. They jumped from a tumbling aircraft lit by flames, knowing that somewhere above them were to live hydrogen bombs, and somewhere below them were sleeping families who had no idea what was coming. Airman First Class Eugene Shelton drifted down toward farmland, watching the sky glow orange from the burning wreckage. He later said, "I knew we were falling with bombs. I didn't know if they were going to go off, but I remember thinking, if they do, I won't feel it." Another survivor, Lt. Adam Maddox, the only man who ejected safely, walked for hours through muddy fields toward the nearest farmhouse. He expected to find devastation. He expected the horizon to be burning. but instead he found a quiet rural community, unaware that their entire world had been seconds away from obliteration. The contrast between what almost happened and what did happen would haunt him for the rest of his life. 12. The secret recovery operation. Within minutes of the crash, military trucks and unmarked vehicles deployed across Wayne County. Helicopters arrived. Troops surrounded fields. Farmers woke up to the sight of armed men digging holes, fencing off land, and refusing to answer questions. The operation had one objective: recover both nuclear weapons before anyone else found them. Bomb 1, as large as a car, was sticking out of a muddy field, its enormous parachute tangled in trees. Bomb 2 was gone, swallowed by the earth. Engineers brought in drilling equipment, water pumps, and construction rigs. The ground was wet and unstable. The bomb had driven itself deep into soft mud under enormous force. After days of work, specialists reached pieces of the bomb's casing, but not the uranium secondary. The deeper they dug, the more water flooded in. The Army Corps of Engineers built a massive cofferdam, draining tens of thousands of gallons. But even that failed. Ultimately, after several weeks, the Air Force admitted defeat. The thermonuclear core was unrecoverable. Rather than risk further excavation and potential contamination, the government made a decision: cover it, bury it deeper, buy the land, seal the area. The public was told nothing. 13. The official cover-up. For decades, the Pentagon insisted publicly that there was never any danger of detonation. Privately, engineers knew the truth. In internal memos, Air Force analysts admitted the Mk-39 design had catastrophic vulnerabilities. One engineer wrote bluntly, "If the aircraft had broken up 500 feet higher, we'd be looking at crater maps today." But in 1961, nuclear secrecy overshadowed transparency. The government feared that revealing the incident would embarrass the U.S. military, undermine public faith in nuclear readiness, encourage Soviet propaganda, increase anti-nuclear political movements, so the truth stayed hidden. Local families were told it was a crash with conventional explosives. Reporters who approached the scene were turned away. A classified envelope marked "restricted data, do not release" buried the findings. Only decades later, declassified documents exposed how close America had come to losing an entire state. 14. The engineering flaw nobody expected. After investigations concluded, scientists identified the root cause of the near detonation. The arming system failed exactly as it was designed because the design itself was flawed. The Mk-39's internal circuitry allowed certain safety steps to activate automatically if the bomb was released with enough force and at the correct angle. And that is exactly what happened during the breakup of the B-52. The parachute on Bomb 1 deployed perfectly. The electrical charge activated perfectly. The arming sequence progressed exactly as intended. In other words, the bomb didn't malfunction. It functioned correctly, as if America had intentionally dropped it on itself. This realization forced Sandia National Laboratories to redesign numerous safety mechanisms across the entire U.S. nuclear arsenal. One engineer famously summarized the lesson: the weapon did exactly what we told it to do. The problem was what we told it to do. 15. What local residents saw. People living near Faro, North Carolina, still talk about that night. They remember intense lights in the sky, flaming debris raining down, soldiers knocking on doors, fields torn open by falling metal, rumors of something radioactive buried underground. One farmer, whose land received the first bomb, later recalled, "It sounded like the sky was ripping open." Others described soldiers carrying odd metal cylinders from the fields. Nobody was allowed near the crash site for months. Some locals believed they were exposed to radiation. Some even claimed livestock died mysteriously. Officially, the government denies any contamination occurred. Unofficially, several environmental surveys remain classified. 16. Political repercussions. A wake-up call in Washington. When top officials finally saw Parker Jones' internal report, many were startled. President Kennedy was briefed on the Goldsboro incident soon after taking office. According to several historians, Kennedy was shaken by the near disaster. He ordered a comprehensive review of nuclear safety protocols protocols. Privately, Kennedy told an aide, "We came closer to nuclear catastrophe in North Carolina than in Cuba." This was not hyperbole. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides hesitated. In Goldsboro, there was no hesitation, only gravity and mechanical failure. The incident strengthened Kennedy's resolve to negotiate nuclear safeguards with the Soviet Union, eventually contributing to the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty. 17. The physics of a nearly lost city. To understand how bad things could have been, we must look at the Mk-39's yield. 3.8 megatons equals 250 Hiroshima bombs equals enough to produce a crater over 1,000 feet wide, equals instant vaporization within a 5-mile radius equals total destruction within 17 miles, equals fatal radiation for 90 miles depending on wind conditions. Raleigh, Goldsboro, and several large towns would have been vaporized, but the secondary effects are even worse. Eastern North Carolina is covered with rivers, wetlands, and agricultural land. A nuclear blast would have contaminated the Neuse River basin, poisoning drinking water for millions. Winds would have carried radioactive fallout up the eastern seaboard, contaminating Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Washington, D.C. would have been under fallout within hours. This single accident had the potential to alter the demographic and economic shape of the East Coast permanently. 18. Lessons still ignored today. The Goldsboro incident remains one of the most sobering examples of nuclear risk in history. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Even today, no nuclear weapon system is 100% safe. Modern designs are far more secure than the Mk-39, but human error and mechanical failure still exist. A 2014 investigation revealed dozens of near accidents in U.S. missile silos, maintenance crews falling asleep, missing launch keys, electrical fires inside missile bunkers, officers cheating on readiness exams, technicians using incorrect tools on live warheads. The Goldsboro crash wasn't an isolated fluke. It was part of a pattern humanity prefers to ignore. 19. The men who carried the secret for decades. The surviving crew members received no medals and no public recognition. They were not permitted to talk about the nuclear weapons they had dropped. They carried the memory quietly, each man dealing with his own version of guilt and relief. Decades later, Adam Maddox, the last surviving crew member, finally spoke publicly. He said he wanted one thing: just tell the truth. Let people know how close we came. He passed away in 2012. He never got to see the full report, declassified. 20. The legacy of Goldsboro today. The field where Bomb 1 landed contains a small historical marker. Tourists rarely visit it. Most Americans have never heard of the incident, but nuclear historians argue that this moment should be as famous as Hiroshima or the Cuban Missile Crisis because Goldsboro was a catastrophe that nearly occurred on American soil. The lesson is simple. Human civilization survived that night not because of brilliant engineering but because one cheap, low-voltage switch happened not to flip. Luck saved North Carolina. Luck saved the East Coast. Luck saved the United States. And luck is the most dangerous nuclear strategy ever invented. One question continues to haunt historians, nuclear engineers, and Cold War scholars. How close did the United States actually come to losing a fully functional hydrogen bomb on its own territory? Not the official version, not the sanitized report, but the real version, the one buried under layers of secrecy. Because when experts began reanalyzing the Goldsboro incident in the early 2000s, with modern nuclear physics models and declassified documents, something disturbing emerged. The United States may have been even closer to a self-inflicted nuclear detonation than originally believed, and the evidence for that comes from three rarely discussed elements. 1. The fragility of Cold War weapons. 2. The electrical design flaw of the Mk-393. The aerodynamic stability of parachute-retarded hydrogen bombs. Let's break them down. 1. The weapons were far more sensitive than the public ever knew in 1961. American hydrogen hydrogen bombs were not fail-proof. They were not even close. The Mk-39 Mod 2 was designed in a hurry in the late 1950s, when nuclear scientists raced to miniaturize thermonuclear weapons. The goal was simple: make them small enough to carry on bombers, but powerful enough to destroy hardened Soviet targets. This rush created compromises. The internal switches were electromechanical, not digital. Wiring was exposed to shock. Safety relays were often fragile. Arming steps could accidentally trigger from sudden deceleration. The Goldsboro crash exposed all of these weaknesses at once. Some engineers later argued that the weapon's design made it vulnerable to sympathetic arming, a phenomenon where a violent physical shock mimics the signals of a deliberate release. In other words, the bomb could interpret a crash as an intentional nuclear strike. Bomb 1 behaved exactly like that. It received the drop signal, the separation signal, the parachute deployment, the high-voltage charging cycle. The capacitor arming sequence, there was no mechanical reason for it not to detonate, except that one low-voltage switch remained intact by pure chance. 2. The electrical flaw no one caught until it was almost too late. When Sandia Laboratories reviewed the Mk-39 circuitry in the late 1970s, they found something worse than anyone expected: a single-point failure mode, meaning if one specific wire broke or one switch rotated a few millimeters, the bomb could bypass the rest of the safety system entirely. This design flaw was not known in 1961. It was discovered only after decades of internal audits. The Goldsboro weapon exploited this flaw unintentionally. Its internal mechanisms responded exactly like they would during wartime deployment. One nuclear safety engineer later said, "We did not have 6 independent safeties. We had one safety disguised as 6. This was the most alarming revelation of all." 3. The parachute ironically made the bomb more dangerous. Hydrogen bombs are not supposed to simply fall and explode. They are supposed to deploy correctly, enter a controlled descent, and reach the correct altitude. The Mk-39 had a parachute that slowed it to the perfect arming speed, but parachute-retarded bombs had a hidden weakness. They were designed to complete their arming sequence during descent. In the Goldsboro crash, Bomb 1 survived the breakup. The parachute opened fully, it descended gracefully. It decelerated exactly as intended, meaning it followed the ideal nuclear delivery profile. If the bomb had hit the ground at a different angle, or if the wind had pulled it north instead of west, the internal weapon components might have completed the final steps of arming. This is why Parker Jones wrote, "It is a miracle we are alive to discuss this hypothesis. Could the bomb have detonated with slightly different crash conditions?" Many nuclear historians believe yes. Here's the commonly discussed but rarely published hypothesis. If Flight 093 had broken up at a slightly higher altitude, Bomb 1 might have received more stable electrical continuity. If it had fallen a few kilometers west, it could have deployed the radar altimeter fully, completing the final firing step. If the low-voltage switch had sheared instead of bending, the detonation signal could have passed straight to the firing capacitor, and if the internal high-voltage generator had not been damaged by impact, the entire firing train could have executed. Several nuclear physicists interviewed in the early 2010s agreed a nuclear detonation was not only possible, it was statistically plausible. This is one of the reasons the Air Force locked down the crash site immediately. They needed to ensure that no one realized how poorly understood the safety systems actually were. The chain reaction that almost happened if the bomb had detonated, experts estimate. The initial fission primary would have ignited the secondary stage, would have compressed the lithium deuteride fuel, would have fused. This would have produced a 2.0-meter fireball, winds of 700 miles per hour, immediate vaporization of everything. In a 5-mile radius, shockwaves felt across 3 states, radioactive contamination. Of the entire eastern seaboard, the fallout plume could have stretched as far as New York. The United States might have been forced to evacuate entire regions. The political consequences would have been beyond imagination. Why this incident changed nuclear doctrine forever after Goldsboro. Senior officials including Canada quietly demanded better bomb design, stricter airborne alert policies, redundant electronic safeties, improved mechanical locking systems, elimination of single-point failures, rethinking of strategic air command procedures. This incident, hidden from the public for decades, is now recognized as one of the turning points in nuclear safety engineering. Some historians argue Goldsboro did more to reform American nuclear policy than the Cuban Missile Crisis, because Goldsboro was not a Soviet threat. It was a mirror, a reflection of the terrifying truth. The greatest danger of the nuclear age was not always the enemy. Sometimes the danger was ourselves.